Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video, and this one's going to completely revolutionize your gameplay. It's probably the most pivotal and impactful thing to know about as far as getting some rating gains and starting to see more success when it comes to PvP, and that is a targeting priority list. So we're going to be constructing a tier list as well as going over a targeting review sheet so that you know what targets are the best to attack in any circumstance, which is going to give you a huge advantage over your opponents. Now, I've broken down basically the three standard setups that you're going to see in an encounter in PvP, which is double melee DPS, one melee DPS, one ranged, and one healer, double ranged DPS, and a healer, because the targeting priorities change depending on what your matchup is. So first off, we've got double melee DPS. When fighting against double melee DPS, unless there is a Frost Death Knight, if there's a Frost Death Knight, you will want to attack the healer. In this case, you will want to attack based on the list that we are going to be constructing here, which one is squishier, basically, which melee DPS is easier to kill, and you'll know that depending on the results of the tier list. But in this circumstance with double melee DPS, you attack the squishier melee DPS and swap off defensive cooldowns to the other one. If the enemy team is a Frost Death Knight, you attack the healer, and this is so that you don't stack up and get clumped up into AoE situations. When you've got double melee DPS and you're fighting one ranged and one melee, your standard strategy is typically to attack the ranged. This way you are stacking the enemy melee DPS on top of the ranged and able to cleave two targets. If you attack the melee, you leave the ranged free to attack, which is not going to be ideal in this circumstance. So typically you're going to want to pressure the ranged when it's double melee versus melee and ranged. And when it's double melee versus double ranged, there is a strategy known as attacking the closest wizard. So you are going to want to attack whichever one of the ranged DPS is the closest to your healer, typically. This way you're always pushing one of the ranged DPS back and preventing them from controlling your healer. And your healers are going to love you if you do this. So that's the strategy of attacking the closest ranged. Other than that, your targeting priority is going to be based off the tier list that we're about to make, depending on which one is squishier, easier to hit. It also depends on what melee DPS spec you're playing. But attacking the closest ranged is generally the safest strategy and the one that I use almost 100% of the time. Now, some classes don't follow that rule. The one melee class that doesn't follow that rule is something like a Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior will, for the most part, just tunnel in on its priority range target for most matches almost all the time. But pretty much every other melee DPS is going to want to switch targets depending on the situation. If the enemy range that your first priority is attacking is just too far away, you switch to the one that is closer. Now, if you're playing melee ranged healer and you're fighting against double melee, you're going to attack based on the tier list, whichever melee DPS is squishier or easier to attack. Now, some compositions with melee range, something like Devastation and Frost DK, you can grip in the healer and swap to the healer. Sometimes you will want to swap to the healer. I would say that melee ranged healer is kind of the most situational, and it depends on who doesn't have a trinket currently if you're a really setup based composition with melee and ranged. So you might switch your targeting to whoever doesn't have a defensive cooldown at a critical moment, but you will still follow the priority list until those situations present themselves. When you're fighting melee ranged healer as melee ranged healer, you generally want to attack the ranged, put them under pressure, limit their damage, and limit their control. But again, it doesn't mean that the other targets aren't available depending on circumstances. If the enemy melee uses a trinket aggressively and you notice that there's an opening, you can swap to them. Or the enemy healer is pushing in and you notice an opportunity, you can swap to them. So this is probably the most difficult composition to play as far as targeting is concerned. But generally, every game is going to start with you attacking the ranged and then adapting depending on the circumstances of the other two players. Now, melee ranged healer into double ranged. This is going to be similar. Attacking closest wizard is always the safest. So if this hunter is the most close to your healer trying to CC, attack them. If their mage is the most close, then attack their mage. And pay attention to their mobility, because an enemy range to push in on top of your healer will often use mobility, which means when you swap to them, they'll have limited mobility to escape you. And that's why that strategy is so effective. And if they don't ever push in on your healer is going to be A-okay the entire game, and you will eventually clump the enemy together. And that's why that strategy is so effective. But when we get to the tier list again, we'll review which targets are really good to go after. And also, same is true here with this as melee caster healer. If the healer ever is like overextending, putting themselves in a bad position, you can swap to the healer. Double ranged versus double melee. Now you're basically going to want to pull the melee away from their enemy healer and try and just kite them in circles and do damage to them, obviously attacking the priority melee based on the tier list. Double ranged against melee ranged healer is the same type of deal. Kind of just kite the melee around in circles away from their team. You can either CC the melee behind a pillar and then push in onto the ranged, or you can just keep kiting the melee and attacking them. Kiting the melee as ranged has generally been the safest and most effective strategy that I have found, but sometimes it might not work, so you may want to switch. Double ranged versus double ranged. This is kind of just like a Wild West shoot off in the middle here, where you're just going to be trying to do maximum damage to anything that kind of gets close to you at any given moment. Whoever kind of pushes in is going to be compromising their positioning, so you do want to make sure that you have pressure before you push in. So do damage before you try and get CC. Keep your pressure going at all times, and this targeting will be decided based on the tier list. So we've covered all three of the major circumstances. So let's get to the specs specifically. If you're up here, it means you should almost always be targeting this first. Most times this is a decent target. Try to avoid and then never, basically. So Affliction Warlock, if there is an Affliction Warlock, you almost always want to attack them. They are not that durable at the moment. They don't have as much self-healing as they did in the past, and you're going to limit their damage output more by attacking them. So they are kind of like a high priority. So back to our list, if we were double melee and there was a Warlock, we would want to attack the Warlock. If there was double ranged, we would want to attack the Warlock. If the Warlock kites away, we can switch, unless you're a Fury Warrior, then you would just keep tunneling the Warlock. That's the type of line that you want to be thinking. It's always based on like, what are you playing and what is the enemy playing compositionally. That's going to determine your targeting. Now, Arcane Mage, this is like very situational. This is kind of like almost never, unless you're a hunter. I'll put like situational here. Situational. So if you're a hunter, you want to be attacking a mage at all times. But for example, like, let's run this back, right? We've had a Warlock and an Arcane Mage, and you're double melee. You would almost never want to attack the Mage over the Warlock, because you're almost never going to actually be able to get to the target. But if you had a Hunter on your team, then suddenly, if you have a ranged on your team, you can attack the Mage, specifically with a Hunter or maybe an Elemental Shaman, something like that, ranged, more instant damage. Both of these casters become more of a viable target. If you're running double ranged, you're going to attack whichever one of them is in the open. So that's how this targeting system works, but it's very situational. Arms Warrior is almost always, so again, if we go back to the graph, if you're fighting double melee and they have an Arms Warrior, it's really good to prioritize them. If you're attacking the ranged and cleaving the Arms Warrior, that's going to be a great one as well to go after. So Assassination Rogue, most times, Assassination Rogue's probably, the easiest rogue spec to be able to kill. So if you had this type of setup here, with like a Warlock and a Rogue, you could go Warlock and then swap to the Rogue. If you had like a Rogue and a Warrior, both of those are ideal. You're not really going to go wrong with either of those. You could just attack whichever one's coming close. Balanced Druid, you're going to almost always attack this. You're going to be stopping CC. You're going to be, limiting damage, and boomkins are really squishy and easy to kill. So if you had melee ranged and this boomkin, attack the boomkin, cleave the melee. If you had double ranged, attack the boomkin unless they pull into a really bad position, and then swap to the other ranged. Now we've got Beast Mastery Hunter. This one's probably going to be a bit more difficult depending on what you are, because they're highly mobile with a ton of instant casts. So generally they can be very difficult to attack. So if we, for example, like pulled up our graph here and we had like BM Hunter and a melee, you would still attack the BM Hunter to try and cleave the melee. But if they had double ranged, that's where it's like, okay, it's a BM Hunter and, double. You don't see BM Hunter a lot in double ranged, but maybe in Shuffle or something like that, BM Hunter and a Boomkin. You would attack the Boomkin until the Boomkin gets into a spot where you can't get to them, and then you would swap to the BM Hunter. Unless you're a Fury Warrior, then you just keep tunneling the Boomkin. But it's a little bit harder to hit. Blood Death Knight is almost never. This is not even a situational thing. This is a Blood Death Knight. Don't attack it. Brewmaster, same deal. Demonology Warlock, this is kind of an almost always, if this is in the game. So if you've got melee ranged, you're going to always attack the ranged in this situation. Double ranged, Demonology is a great first one to pick, and follow the same rules. If they port the kite away, you swap to the other target. Now we've got Destruction Warlock. This is another one that's like almost always going to be a good target. Same rule, ranged melee. Destro Lock, cleave melee. Kite's too far away, you can swap. Double ranged, prioritize the Destro Lock, and then swap to the other target if you need to. Devastation Evoker. This is kind of like a somewhat like a try to avoid. Devastation Evoker is really hard to attack at the moment, and it's really durable. I would say that like if you're a rogue, you're going to obviously go after this. And the rule still applies. Even if, let's say, like you're ranged here, and I've said try to avoid attacking this. If it's the only range to attack, you still prioritize it and cleave the melee. But if it's double ranged, you would probably want to avoid that on priority relative to a different spec in your initial attack, unless you're a rogue. And that's why it's important to listen to the commentary for each of these, because certain specs do counter others. Rogue can definitely own Devastation Evoker, but every other melee will have a decently hard time actually staying attached to them, which is why I would say try to avoid attacking them. Discipline Priest, this is like almost never. If you can AoE them with dot damage, it can be good. So if you're like playing double ranged with multiple dot classes and you see the enemy healer is a Disc Priest and they're in the middle, you can definitely attack them. That is the one circumstance. That's the situational circumstance. But if you're melee attackers, you can try, but it's generally Disc Priest is kind of like avoid. Elemental Shaman is a most times one. Depends on if you're melee or ranged. They can still be very tricky to actually attack. So if you're running double melee into this, you'd attack Ellie because they're the only ranged. If you're running double Ellie or double ranged, there's a Warlock and an Ellie. I would honestly probably prioritize the Warlock at the moment over the Ellie. I think the knockbacks are a bit more disruptive, and you're going to limit more damage, and Warlock is going to be a bit easier to kill at the moment, given the survivability actually that Elemental Shaman's got in this expansion. Now, Enhancement Shaman, this is probably like almost always. Maybe I'll separate this like based on what role you are, and also maybe like what is the most likely to die from left to right. But Enhancement Shaman is like kind of almost always, it's a melee DPS that's really exposed. So again, we follow the same rule. If it was double melee of an Enhancement Shaman, you'd probably want to prioritize them. If you had melee ranged, you'd still go after the ranged, but you can also swap to the Enhancement Shaman when the range goes into a bad position or you're not able to attack them. You can cleave the Enhancement Shaman, and double range they wouldn't exist, so you don't have to worry about that, right? But this guy's a great priority. Feral Druid is kind of decent. They're a lot tankier in this expansion, so they wouldn't be like a main priority. If I had like a warrior and a feral together, I would probably go after the warrior initially, or a feral and enhance. I'd probably go after the enhance initially. But if it's a ranged, like a hunter and a feral, I would go after the ranged and cleave the feral, in that type of situation. Fire Mage, this is a very difficult one because depending on how the Fire Mage plays, and it's not very good, but you would generally want to always attack this. It's very squishy. If you're a hunter, you always attack this. But if you're running, again, double melee, when we're looking at this, and they've got a Fire Mage, you try and go after them, but if they're making it impossible, you're going to have to attack the melee. If they're running double ranged with a Warlock and a Fire Mage, and you're trying to prioritize, I would go after the Warlock over the Fire Mage. So again, this is why I say like from left to right. If they have this class plus this class, you would hit Boomkin. If they have this class plus Fire Mage, probably hit Boomkin. And so from left to right, depending on the tier. Frost Mage, it's decent, I would say. There are certain classes where you just absolutely can't touch it. But generally, if you just leave it completely open, it can also be pretty difficult. If you're ranged, you really want to target it. The same rules still apply. If it's melee ranged, let's say like Rogue Mage, you attack the Mage, cleave the melee. If it's double ranged, you would prioritize the other caster over the Frost Mage in those situations, unless they pull you into a bad position, like I've said. So attack closest wizard, that strategy still remains true. Frost Death Knight, it can be decent. I would say that it's very tanky to kill a Death Knight at the moment, especially as a caster. So Death Knight's kind of like a circumstantial class to attack. If you're a Windwalker or Fury Warrior or something like that, attacking a Death Knight can be a great priority. But if you're a caster DPS dealing spell damage, they should be a lower priority. So you want to take that into account. So if we were a double range DPS caster against a Death Knight and a Warrior, I would attack the Warrior over the Death Knight. But if we were a double melee, like a Windwalker and a Warrior, I would attack the Death Knight over the Warrior. So some classes have innate weaknesses to others, and that's important to take into consideration. Fury Warrior, it's not that great, but it depends on what you play. I'll say it's like a decent target. Maybe try to avoid. It has a lot of self-healing at the moment. I think still here maybe decent. The reason I say it's decent is because it can be kited still pretty easily, and it's a pretty exposed target that you can actually go after pretty frequently. So if you had like double melee with a Fury Warrior and a DK, if I was a caster comp, I'd focus the Fury Warrior. If I was a melee comp, I would probably focus the Death Knight. And that's how I would change my focus. If I was melee ranged healer, I'd probably focus the warrior as well over the Death Knight. So maybe warrior is actually up here, maybe over Death Knight. It kind of just depends on what you're playing. Guardian Druid, do not attack these. Havoc Demon Hunter is really good to attack right now. And again, like these are so close to each other that you can kind of hit either one, and it depends on where they are on the map or what defensives they have and how they're throwing them around. But these targets are generally going to be easier to kill. Demon Hunter is much easier to kill than it was in Dragonfly, especially if you're a rogue, but even if you're other compositions now. Holy Priest, again, most healers are kind of like never situational. Maybe just put the tanks here off to the side. Holy Priest, you can swap to if they don't have Angel Form or something like that, but generally they're easier to CC. Attacking them can be really difficult, although they do have to cast a bit, so if you absolutely need to, you could go onto them. Holy Paladin, if you are going to attack a healer, again, most compositions, your main strategy is not just running at the healer, but Holy Paladin is one of those instances where you can sometimes do that. If you're playing Rogue Mage, you can run at a Holy Paladin. If you're playing double melee, you can run at a Holy Paladin. If you're playing double caster and the Paladin's in the open, you can attack them. So this is like a healer that if you see it in a good spot to attack, you definitely should consider it. But I don't think it should be necessarily your frontline strategy unless you're in those certain circumstances. Marksmanship Hunter, I would put here on most times. Again, if you had like Destro MM, I would probably prioritize the Destro over the MM. I think MM is tankier and you don't disrupt as much, but it can depend. If you're a melee class with Disarm, attacking a Hunter can be really good just to limit their damage in that sense. But I think it is harder to kill at the moment than these specs. So if you're going to prioritize it, you'd follow the same rules. Range DPS, we're going to attack it, swap and cleave the melee. Double range, we'd probably prioritize a Warlock or a Moonkin over the Hunter. But you wouldn't want to necessarily just like totally ignore them in all circumstances. Mistweaver is kind of like a try to avoid. I'd say it's a bit more killable than these two healers, especially if you're like a Death Knight comp. If you're Frost Death Knight comp, most of the time your strat is gripping the healer and trying to kill the healer, so you're kind of like you do actually want to know the priority of like which healers you can and can't attack, or if you're most of the time it's melee cleaves or maybe dot comps, but Mistweaver you can attack. It's gonna be like kind of catching them when they're being aggressive, or if they cheat torpedo into CC or healer, you can kind of go after them. But generally, going after healers is not like the most common line of play, unless maybe you're Rogue Mage and you can catch somebody in like a stun lock like that, or a Frost Death Knight with the amount of burst that they have. Outlaw Rogue is a pretty much never situational type of spec. It's really tanky. It's just generally hard to kill. So if you've got something like Outlaw Rogue Mage, you'd attack the Mage and then cleave the Rogue. And that would be kind of your targeting priority. If you had Outlaw Rogue, and I don't know, like what's a random Outlaw Rogue melee comp that people are playing right now, like Enhancement maybe, you'd prioritize the Enhancement Shaman over the Outlaw Rogue. Preservation Evoker is actually one that you will attack most times if there is a chance to attack them, especially if you're like a melee cleave or a melee caster healer or even a dot class. The main reason that Preservation Evoker isn't that bad of a target is because it's got limited range, so you can actually get close to them and you can punish them by just attacking them and spreading their healing a little bit more thin and creating more opportunities. Now Prez is really strong, but I just say that like if you're in these situations and you notice the healer's overextending, Preservation Evoker is actually one of the best healers for you to actually switch to and punish this type of play. Prot Warrior will just slide down here. Prot Paladin will slide down here. Resto Shaman, this is a situationally really good healer to attack. So I'm going to be putting it up here. I don't think it's as easy to kill as Holy Paladin. But if you're a Death Knight composition, this is like strictly a Death Knight composition. So if you're playing like Death Knight Warlock or Death Knight Ranged and then Death Knight Melee, something like that, you can actually just run at a Shaman. That's like the one circumstance where you can kind of just run at the Shaman. I think some other comps could have that potential. So if you're like really struggling to figure out what to do in a given situation, sometimes just running at the Shaman can actually resolve a lot of those issues. Resto Druid is a decent one. Resto Druids, you spread their hots onto their DPS, and if you can swap to them and cleave them and AoE them, that's like one of the most effective ways to play against them. But I wouldn't say it's as easy to kill them as some of these other healers in a swap, unless maybe you're Rogue Mage. You might be a bit easier to kill, but even these classes, I think if they get swapped to Rogue Mage, it's pretty rough as well. So don't just ignore that, right? Like if all these compositions and what healer they're playing with, you can actually switch to the healer. Ret Paladin is a great one to attack. I'm going to be putting it up here with Warrior and Enhancement. Again, limited melee with limited ranged kicks. These are going to be like really ideal targets to attack. So if you had like Warrior Ret, either of them are really good. Or if you had Ret Enhance, either of them are really good. Demon Hunter or Ret, either of those are really good right now. Again, from left to right, I'd say they're easier to kill. So I would probably prioritize the Warrior. Actually, I don't know. Maybe I'd prioritize the Ret over the Warrior. So put that a little bit more to the left for now. Shadow Priest, this is a very difficult one to rank as far as targeting, because it's kind of one of those situations where if you're playing double ranged, you pretty much don't want to prioritize a Shadow Priest. If you're playing double melee, you do want to prioritize a Shadow Priest. And if you're playing melee ranged healer and they're playing double the Shadow Priest range, you don't really want to. But if they're the only ranged, then obviously you will, because you're going to follow the same rule with melee ranged healer, where you tech the ranged and then switch depending on the situation. So this is a very hard one, because some classes will just do 0 damage to this, like these caster comps, but these physical classes will absolutely smash them. So I'm gonna say like most times for Shadow Priest. I think it's probably the least of the most times. If it was Ellie and Shadow, I'd prioritize the Ellie, or an MM Hunter and a Shadow, I'd probably prioritize the MM Hunter. But if it was a Frost Mage and a Shadow Priest, it depends on what class. Again, like hunters should prioritize mages over Shadow Priests. So there's a little bit of like individual circumstance here. Subtlety Rogue, this is like a never situational spec. Very difficult to kill a good one. At lower ratings, you might be able to get away with targeting it. But if I had the choice between, if it was the double melee, which in Shuffle you might see it, but in threes, you probably not too much. Between like Rogue, Enhance maybe, or Rogue, Ret, or some random comp like that, I'd prioritize these over the Rogue. If it was Rogue Mage, I would go the Mage, and then I would swap to the Rogue with the same rule set that I've been outlining here. Survival Hunter is a decent one. Again, limited, but I'd say it's a bit tankier. It's got a little more self-sustain, a lot more stamina than a lot of the other melee DPS, so it can be a bit more difficult to kill, so it'll be a little bit lower on the priority if you had like double melee or something like that. Unholy DK, it's completely circumstantial. If you're a Fury Warrior, you want to attack this. If you're a spellcaster, you don't. So this is a very tough one for me, but I generally I feel like it's got to be pretty low on the priority. It's really tanky against certain things. And a good Death Knight with Chains of Ice can actually be really difficult to kill. So I don't know. If you're running the double melee, you should attack it though. So I think it needs to be going like somewhere in here probably. But it's completely circumstantial. Vengeance, again, probably don't want to attack the tanks. Windwalker, you kind of want to avoid. They have a lot of defensive cooldowns. They're very slippery. They can be tough to kill in that sense. So they're kind of a lower priority. If you had like Windwalker Warrior, Windwalker Ret, you prioritize the Ret, the slower moving melee that has less escapes. Yeah, I think that's just fair. And then Augmentation Evoker, I want to say it's like never situational. Augmentation is actually really durable. Can be very tough to actually connect to as melee. But if you're ranged, you would want to dot it. And that is like the one circumstance here where I would say you would actually want to attack the augmentation. But this is kind of like let's move this around a little bit. So from left to right, it is squishiest to tankiest, right? So squishiest to like easiest to kill to hardest of its given category. So ranged or melee. Maybe is Ret. I think Ret might be easier than Enhance. Honestly, I'm gonna slide Enhance a little bit down. But I don't know if is it easier than Warrior? I don't think it is, but these ones are very tough. Like I don't think if you're choosing between these, you feel too bad about targeting between them. But from left to right, as far as being like easier to kill, Beast Mastery Hunter, is it easier to kill than Frost Mage? Probably, actually, yes. So we'll slide this around. We'll make sure everything is fitting in here really good. I think Fury Warrior is probably less priority than Survival Hunter. For some reason, you saw these classes together. It might be a little higher than Feral Druid as well. Or if you saw Unholy and Survival together, you would probably want to prioritize the Survival over the DK, honestly. So maybe we slide Survival up a little bit higher on this. Windwalker, I think, is good where it is. Devastation Evoker. Arcane, definitely. Aug, I think, is in a decent spot. We got the healers, we got the melees. Okay, maybe we'll just put the healers on the end here so that everything is nicely organized as far as like worst or best to attack. Disc Priest maybe being the worst. Again, it's all situational. So if you've got to this point of the video and you missed the commentary surrounding one of these specializations, I highly recommend jumping back and actually listening to it, because just because a spec might be a never situational, you need to know what that situational case is, because when you get that, that's going to determine whether or not you're actually having success in that situation. But this is generally my vibe for kind of like what are the best things to attack from left to right, easiest to hardest, and then obviously from top to bottom. So I hope you guys enjoyed this targeting list and strategy review. I hope that it helps you guys figure out what you need to be attacking. Just remember, always look at what you're playing. If you're double melee, and then follow that strategy. Attack the squishiest based on the tier list. If attacking melee ranged healer, attack the ranged, swap depending on the situation if he's running away too much, or somebody uses a trinket or something aggressively. And with the double ranged, attack the closest wizard, and then follow the tier list, obviously. The same thing follows with this. Attack the squishiest melee depending on the tier list. Attack the ranged, swap to the squishiest target after that, or the circumstance presents itself. If you're playing into double ranged, attack the closest wizard or the squishiest wizard initially, and then double ranged, same deal. Attack the squishiest melee based on the tier list. Attack the melee and kite away. Attack the closest wizard, do max damage before you push in, and attack based on the priority of the tier list. So that's kind of the matrix. That's how everything works together. Thank you very much once again, and I will see you in the next video.